Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sunday service of Now Creations. Before I begin today, I'd like to make a couple of announcements. The first one, obviously, Happy Father's Day to all present fathers, past and future fathers-to-be. I know of nothing more challenging that gives the full gamut of life experiences than simply being a parent. Raising kids with all of the ups and downs involved, with spouses, with family members. Kudos to all of you who parent, and also kudos to everyone who nurtures. Well done, well done. I also want to mention that we're very happy, and you should have received an email this week, to announce the formation of a members committee. It is being chaired by John Shartle, and the members committee will reflect, hopefully, the membership of our organization and provide ideas that will assist us for our future evolution and growth. Happy to include in those members Angie Cummins-Boyd, John Hoops, Tony and Patty Nakino, and Marta Stone. Thank you to all of you. Before I give the teaching today, I'd like to do a teaching before the teaching. Let me begin by, first of all, again showing you one of the beautiful roses from our garden. This beautiful rose, I understand, is called a peace and love rose, especially was a hybrid after the Second World War to foster peace and love. But let me just say a couple of other things about it. When you see this rose, you see a great beauty within it. What is very interesting is that the Earth itself was considered to be a planet that would reflect beauty. Let me just say it again. The Earth itself is considered to be a planet that reflects beauty. When you look at this rose, do you not see a beauty within your own self? Is there not something within you that just says, that's beautiful, that's beautiful? It simply is reflecting your beauty. I want you to know that deeply. The rose is simply reflecting your beauty. I'll take a moment to smell the rose for all of you. Let me now begin our formal teaching here this morning, and what a joy it is to do so. A part of the joy is the fact that each one of us is not only growing in awareness, but many of us are just doing so well in displaying acts of love, kindness, and understanding. I just want you to know how important that is, the goodness that you're bringing to the planet, and you are helping others to see the beauty that is within them. It is quite a joy to live heaven here on our planet, a joy in which many of us are now excelling. Whenever I give a weekly teaching, I usually have no problem coming up with a title. This week's teaching was somewhat different, perhaps revealing the depth of the insight that the teaching presents. I debated between entitling it as A Veil Lifted or A Huge Illumination. I'll let you decide which is appropriate, a veil lifted or a huge illumination. Let me also say that this could be a life-changing teaching for you. It has been for me. Let's begin with a response to some teachings that one of our members would often make. When I would give a teaching, she initially thought, what in the world is Vince talking about? She just didn't grasp what I was saying at the time. Then perhaps maybe 3 to 6 months later, she would have that aha moment. Now I know what he was saying. It just took a while to sink in. Such a teaching I presented in last week's teaching on creative love, when I made a distinction between the radiant being, the radiant center of love that you are, which creates from the love within you, and the objects of our love, from people to possessions. While this distinction is logically very clear, it takes a lot of time to understand. And quite frankly, it takes even more time to live. But quite frankly also, it is worth the experience. It's difficult to live because, quite frankly, we have so much of an undue way of looking at life that we have to undo in order for us to experience the fact that we have grown. There's a lot to undo, and I'll try to unravel that in our teaching. Remember, I said it could be called a big veil that we are now lifting, or a huge illumination. Let me now respond to the notion that this could be a very big veil, a very big illumination through two particular teachings, and then to address the issue practically. The first teaching. The first teaching seems rather harmless, but it contains a huge fallacy. A question is often posed in the following manner: what makes you happy? What makes you happy? The person then usually presents a list of the things that make them happy. Let's limit the list simply to five of which I think are probably the most important. The first one, relationships. I'd like to have a significant other in my life. Secondly, money. Enough money at least to live a carefree life. A good job, which is also satisfying. Physical health, a sense of physical well-being. And then again, time for your personal pursuits, whether it's loving animals or loving God. As I indicated, there is an inherent fallacy to this question because it disregards two important factors. The first factor is that all of the things mentioned above, from physical health to money to relationships, contain within them a susceptibility, a huge susceptibility to change. Things change. What seems to be the bloom of love today often becomes tomorrow's frustration or tomorrow's uncertainty. Perhaps this person is not quite the person you thought they were. And perhaps maybe all of a sudden you're in a situation where you have made vows and yet are rather unhappy. And not only do people change, but things change. Jobs change. Health changes. Money changes. Do you not see the fallacy with the question, what makes you happy? The question implies that the present objects of affection will always be your objects of affection. Let me just repeat that. The fallacy is that the question, what makes you happy, implies that the present objects of affection will always be your objects of affection. The question does not take into account, at least sufficiently, the fallacy that you are basing your life on temporary things that change. And then secondly, oftentimes you enter into a tough predicament that's very hard to get yourself out of. And the future is not so bright because even if you get out of the predicament, you often end up seeking happiness again, and you fall into the game of the uncertainty of change. Life just seems to be an endless gamble of hoping for happiness. with the odds seemingly stacked against you. Now, there is a solution to the happiness question, which is also the basis for the creative love solution. The solution is this. Instead of asking the question, what makes you happy, encourage people to seek happiness first within. Because then happy people will do happy things. Rather than depending on people and situations to bring happiness to you, with all of the inherent pitfalls of change, a happy person does not rely on things to make them happy, but rather because they are happy in themselves, they do happy things. And when their happy things change, which they will do, it does not destroy the happiness that is within them. Happy people do happy things. And when those happy things change, and they will, it does not take away their happiness. Let me say again that this reasoning makes logical sense, but oftentimes it does not make common sense because we are so strongly taught to look outside of ourselves for happiness, trying to find outside of ourselves what is only within ourselves. As I said, this view of happiness enables us to understand creative love much easier. Creative love also distinguishes between the love within ourselves, which comes primary and first, and then loving people and objects secondarily. But before we look at this even further, let me briefly allude to the work of Eckhart Tolle in his wonderful book entitled The New Earth. In the book, Eckhart offers us a better look at our lives by enabling us to distinguish the difference between the contents of the ego and the structure of the ego. Again, the ego being that limited human concept of self that is the root of so much of our limited thinking. As you would probably surmise, the contents of the ego are all the things that we have previously mentioned, all of the things such as a good relationship, money, health, personal growth, etc. Now, someone might say, well, what's wrong with these things? Eckhart would say, there is nothing wrong with the contents of the ego, but there is something drastically wrong with the structure of the ego. Nothing wrong with the contents. The problem is with the structure. Let me explain. Did you ever deal with the 2-year-old child who, when asked to share a toy, or when you try to take a toy away from them, shouts, "That's mine! That's mine!" Herein is the structure of the ego of a 2-year-old, of a 22-year-old, of a 42-year-old, or of an 82-year-old. The structure of the ego says, in fact, often shouts, "That's mine! That's mine!" Now here's where the structure of the ego becomes so dangerous. Eckhart states that the structure of the ego identifies with the contents of the ego. Let me say it again. Eckhart states that the structure of the ego identifies with the contents of the ego. That's mine. Then Eckhart explains that the word identify, which comes from 2 Latin words, idem, which means the same, and facere, to make, identification means to make the same. Now do you see the huge problem? The ego makes the contents of the ego into an identity. Let me say it again. The ego makes the contents of the ego into an identity. And then the worst thing happens. The ego makes its identity with the contents of the ego into its sense of self. It identifies. It makes the same the contents of the ego with one's sense of self. Do you now see what Eckhart means by the structure of the ego? It says, that's mine, and then identifies the ego with its contents. Well, you know the story from here. The structure of the ego has the same problem as the happiness question. It bases its happiness on the same changing, temporary things. And when they change, the ego changes from the thrill of victory to the agony of defeat. Well, is there any way out of this dilemma of temporary forms? Temporary forms. Yes, of course there is. But remember I said that you would call this teaching a veil lifted or a huge illumination. Either way, it will take time, it will take attention, but what a dilemma it will solve for you. Again, this may be life-changing for you. Here we go. Now remember what I said when I mentioned that the happiness question has a better answer if you first understand that a happy person will do happy things rather than look outside of themselves for happiness. As I said, you are in store now for a big veil to be lifted, a huge illumination, so let me proceed. I, probably like you, was raised with the understanding that we love people and things. Never did anyone ever say to me, Vince, you are love. Vince, love originates with you. In fact, Vince, love is who you are. No one ever said that to me. As a result, I, probably like you, loved the people in my life and many objects in my life. And I, probably like you, was often disappointed when the people in my life let me down or I let them down. And I was extremely sad when one of my family members or dear friends passed, especially when my high school sweetheart died suddenly in an accident and my dear wife passed suddenly with a cerebral aneurysm. People would respond by saying, tough break. Well, that's life. What are you going to do? Is life eventually to simply end in disappointment? And I, like you, probably notice the same thing with people who love things. They were rich. They had nice homes, good jobs, nice clothes, went on nice vacations. Money seemed to talk loudly. They had financial security until they aged and died and left their money for someone else to have money, and then they died in disappointment as well. Do you not see that there is only an endless cycle of loss and disappointment when you simply love objects, whether they be people or things, before you realize that you are a loving creator who brings love to people and things. Let me just say it again. Do you not see the endless cycle of loss and disappointment when you simply love objects, people, or things before you realize that you are a creative, loving energy who brings your love to people and things? It's so easy to forget who you are and to get lost in the endless cycle of temporary forms that promise so much but deliver relatively little until you remember that you are first and foremost a loving creator who brings love to people and things, which are temporary forms as well. But you are not a temporary form. You are not a temporary form. You continue to be the changeless, creating, loving being, always ready for your next creation, having learned what you needed to from the past, and ready now for your next loving creation. As I said, it's so logical. It makes perfect sense. And now it's becoming common sense. In conclusion, I believe that we are moving forward in the understanding that we are creative love. It's the essence of who we are. It is who we are before we even thought about who we are. As I said, understanding this teaching is a veil lifted, or a huge illumination. Could be life-changing. But I have saved the best for last. As you continue to experience your life as a radiant being of creative love, just like the God Spirit that we are, then you and I bring radiant love to the present people and the present situations of our lives, in ways, quite frankly, that surprises them. And you know what? It even surprises ourselves that we could be so loving. Your love is pure and undefiled, as it was always meant to be. And you are happy because a veil has been lifted. And you have received a huge illumination and are confident that the future will now take care of itself. Let me take you into meditation, and what a joy it is to do so. Let us begin our meditation as we normally do by simply focusing on the breath. And again, focusing on the breath, just your natural breathing rhythm, nothing forced, but simply feeling the rhythm of your breath. Allow the breath to settle you and bring your soul to the fore. Please begin. And just for another moment, continue the breath and enjoy the feeling you are now experiencing. Now I'm going to ask you to notice two things. The first one, did you notice how easy it was to move into the bigger part of you? It's kind of like the bigger part of you is more than the vehicle that you have. Did you notice that? That your sense of self is far exceeding simply your human personality. Would you reflect on that, please? And would you notice how this expanded sense of you is just more and more you? Your identity is from that higher self. Just notice that. Now I'm going to ask you to notice the second thing. Would you notice the feeling you have when you say these words? I'm happy. Can you notice the difference from the present time than maybe from a past time. In the past, you might have said something like, I'm kind of happy, or maybe I'm happy. But now, when you say, I'm happy, is that not a present satisfaction? Don't you feel happy, content, not in need? Notice this. And would you affirm to yourself, because I am a happy person, I do happy things. I'm not dependent in my happiness. I am independently happy. This is a big step for you to say this. I am independently happy. Is a veil being lifted? Let us now proceed. Would you now say to yourself, I am a radiant being of creative love. I am a radiant being of creative love. And would you just notice how content you are being a radiant being of creative love? Just notice how whole and complete, how not needy, unwanting, independent you are. Notice this. And now that more practical part, the everyday part, because you are a radiant being of creative love, you lovingly create in your relationships and in your life situations. You bring radiant love to the planet. With the people and the situations that comprise your life. You are an independent, creative lover. Yet committed to loving the people and situations that comprise your life. Don't get confused. Don't get confused. Sometime, someday, the objects of your affection might not be there. And while a sadness might come into you for a moment, you still are that creative lover, fully present. Are you beginning to see the huge illumination? Huge illumination that is really who you are. A creative lover. Just focus on the breath. Let it take you where it takes you. And in a moment, I'll allow the music to take you even further.
the light shines bright to illumine love without, love within. I honor thee. I honor thee. Namaste. I honor thee. I honor thee. I honor thee. Namaste. I honor thee. When you are where you need to be, within that space, I honor thee. Seeing through eyes an illusion, seen through spirit, we are one. I honor thee. I honor thee. I honor thee. Namaste. I honor thee. I honor thee. I honor thee. Namaste. I honor thee. Namaste. I honor
My dear friend, I encourage you to ponder today's teaching and meditation. If it hasn't already, it has the potential of becoming life-changing for you. Which enables us to say, I am an eternal being of light and love. Thus, only good can come to me, and only good can come from me. We are eternal beings of light and love. Thus, only good can come to us, and only good can come from us. Namaste, dear blessed ones. Namaste.